In the world of motion picture data cameras, is a bigger sensor better than a smaller sensor? To answer this, we should start with standard Academy 35mm motion picture film and the APS-C sensor. This sensor pretty much matches the frame size of standard 35mm cinefilm. The Blackmagic Pocket has a sensor the same size as 16mm film, which is slightly smaller than the Micro Four Thirds. The full frame sensor is a byproduct of using a stills camera to shoot motion pictures. The format is not common to cinematography. It was designed to match the horizontal film feed of a stills camera. There was a format introduced in the mid-50s that ran film horizontally, called VistaVision, and many films of this era used the format, but the size of the cameras made it difficult to shoot with, and it disappeared from production fairly quickly. 70mm movie film will give you a similar focal length as a full frame, but with a different aspect ratio. Very few 70mm or VistaVision cine lenses actually exist, and the ones that do are ridiculously expensive, so most cinematographers shoot with stills lenses when using this format. The Micro Four Thirds sensor is also not common to cinematography, being slightly smaller than the 35mm and slightly larger than the 16. So, does the fact that these two sensor sizes were not native to cinefilm make them inferior? And of the two, which is superior? Any film school grad, or indeed enthusiast, will tell you that the larger the sensor, the shallower your depth of field, and currently, a shallow depth of field is very popular. I love an image with a shallow depth of field. It not only looks aesthetically pleasing, it adds depth, and can be used to help in storytelling. There are three ways to produce a shallow depth of field. One is focal length. The greater the focal length of your lens, the shallower your depth of field. Two is aperture. The wider the aperture of your lens, the shallower the depth of field. And three, sensor size. The larger your sensor, the shallower your depth of field. But number three is not exactly true. Having a shallow depth of field with a large sensor is a symptom of manufacture. It's not strictly a law, not optically. To understand why a larger sensor appears to have a shallow depth of field, you have to understand how a lens reacts to distance. Take this 135mm cine lens and this shooting scenario. The background trees are 120 feet from the camera sensor. The subject is 60 feet from the camera. The camera is focused on the subject, which is 60 feet in front of the trees. Now you would expect a distance of 60 feet to knock out the focus of the background quite a lot, but if you look at the focus ring on the lens, there is very little difference between 60 and 120 feet on the ring. Thus, very little difference between the points of focus. Now, if I took the camera and placed it 15 feet from the subject, I would set my focus here at 15 feet. I am now also closer to the background. It is only about 90 feet from the camera. Notice though, how far you would have to pull focus to get to 90 feet. The point of focus of the trees is much further than the focus of the subject, making the depth of field shallower and the trees even more defocused, even though you are closer to them. Let's push our subject even closer to the trees and set the distance of our subject at 12 feet away from the lens. Even though the trees are only 25 feet from the camera, the distance from the point of focus on the subject is considerably further than when the camera was 120 feet from the trees and 60 feet from the subject, giving it a shallower depth of field. To get the most separation of focus and shallowest depth of field, we can bring the camera back to 120 feet from the trees and bring the subject to 12 feet in front of the camera, creating a huge distance on the focus ring and the shallowest depth of field so far. Most backgrounds will be on or beyond infinity. To best achieve a shallow depth of field, the trick will be to get your point of subject focus as far from infinity as possible. The further apart your points of focus are on your focus ring, the shallower your depth of field. So now we know that depth of field is actually governed by the distance between the points of focus on your lens. How does the size of your sensor relate to and affect your depth of field? All sensor sizes affect this rule, not just Micro Four Thirds and full frame. And this is how. Let's take a 50mm lens. Place a subject 30 feet from the camera. The light from the subject will pass through the lens, shining onto your sensor. The Micro Four Thirds sensor is small and close to the rear of the lens, so the image captured is cropped. If we keep the same setup but change the Micro Four Thirds sensor to a 35mm sensor, like the Alexa or the Epic, this sensor is a bit smaller than the full frame sensor, but approximately double the size of the Micro Four Thirds. we see that because of its size and further distance from the rear of the lens, all of the subject fits on the sensor. Now, if you want to use the same lens but get the entire subject onto a Micro Four Thirds sensor, you will have to move your camera further away from the subject. To get the same size image, you will have to move back to 60 feet, so your subject focus on the lens becomes closer to infinity. Your background is now half as far from the focus of your subject, and there goes your shallow depth of field. Another way to get the entire subject on your frame is to half the focal length of your lens. If you change to a 25mm, that will fit the entire subject because it is a wider lens, but your focal depth will also half. There seems to be no way around it. Smaller sensors equals greater distances from subjects, or wider lenses. If we put a super 35mm sensor in position, we see the subject will be half the size in the frame. This is approximately the ratio. If you want telephoto shots, the Micro Four Thirds will give you tighter frames. If you want wide-angle shots, the super 35mm will be better for getting those. So at 50mm, this is the crop ratio you can expect from both these sensors. Without a crop factor, the Micro Four Thirds will have to half the lens's focal length. This is why larger sensors can capture shallower depths of field. This is taught in film school, and most of us know the symptom of large versus small sensors. But depth of field is not the only symptom between the two sensor sizes, and the other symptoms are rarely taught in film school, or anywhere else. Let's look at raster. This is a video term that is rarely used in data. However, other than the recording format and scanning process, all data cameras are fundamentally still very much video cameras, and they are governed by raster lines just as video cameras were. The word raster comes from the Greek word for rake. This is because all images are made up of horizontal lines. The resolution of a camera is governed by the amount of horizontal lines in a frame. These are the numbers 720, 1080, 2K, 4K, and so on. The characteristic of the raster is not so much the amount of lines of the image that make up the picture. More importantly is the gaps between the lines. This is a format guide for the Red Dragon. You can set the Epic and Dragon to several different sensor sizes. I find this to be one of the most useful tools available to the modern data cinematographer, and I use this function regularly. Red cameras are all format linked, which means as the sensor size goes up, the resolution increases. Thus, the image quality of every shot, regardless of the sensor size, is the same. Take for instance the 2K, approximately the size of a 16mm film. This has 2K of resolution, or 2K raster. 4K is twice as large, approximately the size of Academy 35mm film. To ensure the image quality remains exactly the same regardless of the sensor size, Red doubled the resolution, ensuring that the space between the lines of the raster remains the same. At 5K, they added more lines accordingly, and so on. Now, let's say you are shooting with a Micro Four Thirds camera with 1920 by 1080 of resolution. Your raster will look like this. If you were shooting with a super 35mm sensor, which is smaller than a full frame, with the same resolution, 1920 by 1080, to get this, to fit this, you have to do this. So let's visit our side-by-side again. If both sensors are the same resolution, their raster will look like this. The Micro Four Thirds will have half the space between its raster, thus a sharper, clearer image. Does this new information even out the depth of field issue? Perhaps not. I've always said there's more to a good picture than its clarity, but there's more. Because the Micro Four Thirds sensor is small and in such close proximity to the lens, the rear element of a Micro Four Thirds lens has to focus the light onto the sensor, in contrast to a super 35mm or full frame sensor, which have rear lens spreaders that spread the image to fit the sensor. This results in a crisper, brighter image. The fastest available high-speed lens for a super 35mm camera is f1.3. The fastest lens for Micro Four Thirds is an incredible f0.95. Here is a Voigtlander Micro Four Thirds high-speed prime, and here is 0.95. If you haven't shot with 0.95 yet, it's incredible. So, back to our side-by-side. Does a sharper focus and extra f-stop make up for the lack of shallowness to your depth of field? Perhaps not. But another advantage of the Micro Four Thirds sensor is its narrow flange depth. The flange depth is the distance between the lens's mount and the sensor. Because the Micro Four Thirds mount is so close to the sensor, in fact this is what the micro in Micro Four Thirds is referring to. This means all other lenses like EF or PL should sit outside the body of the Micro Four Thirds camera. This allows you to place a mount adapter between the camera and the lens, making the Micro Four Thirds camera capable of accepting almost every lens of every camera and every mount ever made. And there are plenty of mount adapters available. And now, the game changer. There are mount adapters that have a focusing rear element that can refocus the light from the spreader of a large format lens onto the Micro Four Thirds sensor. Some of these adapters are called speed boosters because they boost the light from an f1.4 lens up to 75% of a stop, giving you an equivalent opening of a little less than f0.95. This is very useful, but it also has another function that I feel is far more useful and somewhat overlooked. By refocusing the light onto a smaller area, allowing the 50mm to have the same image size as it would if it were on a large sensor, it shrinks the subject by half, allowing us to move our subject closer to the camera, changing the distance back to 30 feet. So we can now set our subject focus back to 30 feet, extending the distance from infinity, giving us the same shallow depth of field as a super 35mm sensor, but still availing of the extra stop, tighter raster, and vastly expanded lens compatibility. I would never say that Micro Four Thirds sensors were better than full-frame sensors. They are both different, and you should choose the sensor best for you with the equipment you have available. But I would also never say large sensor cameras are better than small ones. Every camera has its strengths and weaknesses, if you have the right equipment for them and you know how to use them to their full potential. I hope this film has been useful to you.